It's now been 40 years since the fall of Saigon brought an end to the Vietnam War and to American involvement in conflict in Indochina, though not, unfortunately, to the suffering of the people in that region. You can't go wearing a black armband today because it's also the 70th anniversary of the death of Adolf Hitler, which tends rather to overshadow the fall of Saigon in discussions of geopolitics. I know every discussion ends with Hitler, and that's a bad thing. But the fact is, when people are being obtuse about the consequences of not standing up to aggression, you find yourself saying, yeah, well, what about the Nazis? For good reason. And yet we also want to think about the lessons of Vietnam. Now, in 1975, the lessons drawn from Vietnam were as extreme as those of any Cold Warrior who saw any threat anywhere in the world as another Nazi party. The left said it's American imperialism, Western arrogance that causes the trouble in the world. Indochina without Americans, for most a better life, was a characteristic headline. The exact opposite happened. It turned out the people in charge of North Vietnam were not reformist agrarian nationalists, but dedicated brutal communists. And Cambodia, of course, was plunged into the hideous Khmer Rouge genocide. Over time, though, a rather more thoughtful assessment of the war arose, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't go in if we don't have an exit strategy. Not every war is our war. But there was a counter-argument that grew in strength in the late 70s and early 80s, saying, you know what, the fall of Vietnam was as bad as the hawks had said it would be. The Soviets went on a rampage. Clients of Moscow took over any number of countries in Africa and again inflicted terrible suffering on the population. Boat people poured out of Indochina. There were Marxist regimes even in Latin America. And there's a pretty straight line from the fall of Saigon in 75 to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Now at this point the Doves came back and said, yeah, it looked scary at the time, but the fact is the Soviets were overreaching as the Americans had before them. You need to learn prudence, learn that every fight is not your fight. But the hawks came back and said, the thing is, if you don't check aggression far away where it doesn't seem to matter, pretty soon it'll be happening on a larger scale somewhere closer to home. And the fact that we held the line in Vietnam for so long, even if in the end that war ended badly, it slowed down the Soviet rampage. It helped to stretch the Soviet empire, gave it time to rust, so that the Soviets of 1975, 1979 were actually less formidable than they would have been in 1961 or 65 if we just let them roll over Indochina and go looking for another target. Richard Nixon wrote an especially compelling book, No More Vietnams, about this kind of lesson. So it's true, every dictator is not Hitler. Every war is not World War II. Unfortunately, in that not every war has a clean, decisive ending that's a victory for us. Fortunately, in the sense that not every war is an existential threat to our way of life. But if we don't fight the holding actions, the somewhat morally ambiguous wars in distant countries where it's hard to be sure what would constitute victory or how to get it, we will find ourselves again with our back to the wall. So the final lesson about the Vietnam War is that it was worth fighting, even though the North Vietnamese Politburo was not actually Adolf Hitler.